Welcome to Concepts in American Government at Mesa Community College. This video explores the formation of the American idea. To understand American ideology, we need to understand the British tradition. But to understand the British tradition, we need to go back even further, beginning with the Greek and Roman states, which heavily influenced political thinking in Western Europe. The Roman Republic was viewed by many in antiquity as an ideal state. Now, from our standpoint, it's pretty less than ideal. Only the elite got to participate. The masses were either slaves or free citizens who lived in pretty much abject poverty. So few modern people would be happy living in a Roman state. But compared to the tribal warlords or the despotic empires or the vassal kingdoms who surrounded the Roman Republic, the Republic was a pretty good gig. So it was idealized by Western thinkers long after the Republic had collapsed. Now, the philosophy of classical republicanism is that the public would promote the common good of the people. So the citizens voluntarily contribute to the common good, and the government's primary objective is to achieve the common good. Now, to do that, there are three requirements that it was felt had to be in place for this arrangement of classical republicanism to work. The first was civic virtue, that citizens would voluntarily obey the law and work towards the common good. The second was moral education, that the children had to be socialized to accept the morality of the state that they lived in, that they weren't rabble-rousers, overturning the cart, so to speak. They bought into that public morality. And then the third was that there were small, uniform communities, because change and otherness are threatening to this collective good achievement that they wanted. It was felt that the society had to be pretty much homogeneous. People looked like each other, spoke the same language, had the same religion, because anything that was outside of that commonness was a threat to the collective good. Now, of these three concepts, requirements for classical republicanism, civic virtue was seen by the founders of the American government as the most important. So let's explore this idea of civic virtue further. If you look at the picture on the upper right, the rural intersection, that's a classic example of a test, if you will, of civic virtue. When you come up to an intersection in the middle of nowhere, and it's 2 a.m, there's no one around. You could see a headlight on another car from miles away. There's nobody there, and there's a stop sign. Do you stop? Your answer to that question is a measure of the civic virtue you have. If you stop at that intersection in the middle of the night with no one around, because it's the right thing to do, that indicates that you are practicing civic virtue. But if you blow through that stop sign because you feel that there will be no penalty, you can get away with it, and you feel that there is no risk to yourself because in your judgment there isn't anybody there, well, that's an indication that your civic virtue might be lacking a little bit. The founders argued that element, that quality of civic virtue, was absolutely essential for democracy to survive, because a citizenry that was going to govern itself politically had to be capable of governing itself behaviorally, that it had to put limits on its own behavior rather than be coerced or compelled to behave in a certain way by the state. A society that lacks civic virtue can expect to have expansive government and lots of really inane rules. It's possible to compel peons to do stuff, but that requires a police state to do it. Why do you drive on the left-hand side of the road? Well, you don't. You drive on the right-hand side of the road because it would be crazy to drive on the left-hand side of the road. But let's say you lived in a society where people drove on whatever side of the road they wanted to drive on. There's no civic virtue. Well, that's a place where no one really gets anywhere. You need to be driving on the right-hand side of the road because it's safe, and because if everyone drives on the right-hand side of the road, everyone gets where they want to go quickly and safely. Now, can the government force you to ride on the right-hand side of the road? Well, sure, it is in the law. They could post a police car every mile to grab anybody who's not driving on the right-hand side of the road, but that's not exactly a free society. Now, if we look at the most current examples of corporate malfeasance and the collapse of the economy, what resulted from that? From people who bent the rules or through their own greed felt that they could do something that maybe it's not illegal, but it's not exactly ethical. And as a result, they crashed the economy. Well, the result is a package of financial regulations, a new set of rules that's going to force people to follow prescribed guidelines because they now can no longer be trusted to stay within those guidelines on their own initiative. And as a result, we have a society that's a little less free than it was before the financial breakdown, because we have a whole new set of rules that have to be followed. It's an example of a society incrementally losing its freedom because it lacks virtue. This is what our founders worried about and argued that we had to maintain this ability of living our lives and practicing civic virtue in order for our democracy to continue. Now, history tells us that the Roman Republic collapsed and turned into an empire, the Roman Empire. Now, hundreds of years later, this empire also collapsed, bringing a period of anarchy into Western Europe. We call this period the Dark Ages. And the reason we call it the Dark Ages is because, well, it was dark. It was a situation pretty close to the state of nature that those philosophers talked about. There was a life that was nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes put it. It was a time where the big guys with swords took whatever they wanted to take because there was no state, no government to stop them from doing so. Now, the Dark Ages ended with the advent of feudalism, and with it a restoration of state authority. We call this period the medieval period. Now, what feudalism was about, the reason that it reasserted the bonds of state authority was it set up bonds of fealty. And so what would happen was the emperor would carve up his empire into component parts, and he would say, okay, king, this piece of territory is yours. And in exchange for your loyalty and this piece of real estate, you owe me a week of your time. And I want you to show up with your whole army and do whatever I tell you to do. And the king said, great. And the king then carved up his kingdom into smaller parts and said to his princes, this territory is yours. And in exchange for this piece of territory, you owe me 2 weeks of your time. And the prince said, great. And then the prince carved up his territory and went to his dukes and said, Duke, this territory is yours. And in exchange, you owe me 3 weeks of time with your men of war. And the duke says, great. And the duke carves up his territory even further and tells his knights, this piece of territory is yours. In exchange, you owe me 4 weeks of labor. And the knight says, great. And that's as far down as it went. Below that were the peons, the citizens, the people who had no real rights. They they had to stay on the land. They were the property of the duke or knight or king that was over them. But it established a line of hierarchical authority that could control territory and protect the population from the marauding hordes that had been running through Europe prior to that. And so it was a workable arrangement. And with this came the notion of the divine right of king that I spoke about in a previous presentation, where the concept of an authoritarian monarchy was established. And William the Conqueror brought this notion of feudalism to England. At this point, British history diverged from that of continental Europe in one important way: the development of the concept of a limited state. Now, this origin was with the development of Parliament. Parliament began as kind of a cabinet for the king, some advisors, but as the aristocrats who made up Parliament grew in power, the king became threatened by that power, and the Parliament ended up fighting the king over how much power they ought to have. The king tried to impose a new set of taxes, and the Parliament rebelled, and thus ensued the English Civil War, which was fought over the sovereignty of the king versus the Parliament. Now, the king lost that war, and so the forces of Parliament forced the king to sign a document called the Magna Carta. And what the Magna Carta established was the rule of law, which was that the king is bound by rules. There were things the king could not do. Chief among them was the establishment of the right of habeas corpus. Now, that's a fancy Latin word for produce the body. And what that means is that if you are charged with a crime, if the police come and throw you in jail for some reason, or back in these days, if the king grabs you and puts you in his dungeon, you can only do that for a certain period of time. And at the end of that time, he must charge you with a crime and produce some bit of evidence that there's some reasonable suspicion that you've in fact committed that crime. And that's what the produce the body means, is that the body has to be brought out of the dungeon in front of a judge in a public hearing where the charges are tried against them. And so this right of habeas corpus is a fundamental right and is the beginnings of a limited state. Now, there were other rights that followed, but the Magna Carta is the bedrock foundation for this concept of a limited state. The rights that were set forth in the Magna Carta were expanded by the Petition of Right in 1628 and the English Bill of Rights in 1689. Together, these rights form the origin of British common law, and they're things like a trial by jury, so that the king could not arbitrarily find someone guilty of treason or perjury. They'd have to actually bring evidence and put that evidence in front of the peers of the person being accused, so that it forced the king to actually have evidence. So it's a check on the arbitrary use of power by the king. No taxation without the consent of Parliament. Parliament said, if you're going to raise taxes, you have to have our permission to do so. Now, it's important to know that these rights were only accorded to the aristocracy by these agreements. This is not a grand civil rights movement in the 1600s, but it created the precedent for limitations by the king to this class of privileged subjects. And then over time, these rights were expanded to all free citizens within the British realm. And that process took hundreds of years, but it is the origin of this concept of a limited state that the British colonists who lived in the Americas hearkened back to. The idea of a constitution, or that a constitution is necessary for government to be legitimate, also originates in England. What that word means, constitutionalism, is that a constitution is the laws or customs that limit government, and it is a higher, more fundamental law that all other law is based upon. So that's what a constitution is, and constitutionalism is the idea that the government or the agents of the government are limited by that higher or fundamental law. Now, in England, most of the rights that are considered constitutional rights were secured by customs and judicial case law. So as I said in the previous slide, the expansion of rights beyond the aristocracy to the rest of the free citizenry in England was done through this process of gradual customary or judicial precedent that grants these rights and privileges or recognizes these rights and privileges that are there. And as that happens over time, it just becomes the law that is agreed upon, or the constitutional law. Unlike the American Constitution, though, these customs and precedent are not written down in any one place, but rather it's the entire body of tradition and history and juridical precedent that composes the British Constitution. So while the form of the Constitution is quite different between the Americans and the British, the concept, the idea that government will be limited in its actions by this fundamental law is what originates in England and is part of the British heritage or tradition. So let's turn to the experience of the colonists then. When the colonists arrived, the British colonists anyways, they believed they had returned to the state of nature. They were on a new land. The native tribes that were living in this land were weak politically, militarily, and so the European colonists, particularly the British colonists, were able to carve out the land, and they viewed the land erroneously, but they viewed the land as empty and a new country, a new land. And so the philosophical debates about the state of nature that we discussed in earlier presentations were not philosophical to the original colonists. They believed that they were in a state of nature, which meant that they could not rely on the customs and the tradition and the legal precedent that they had experienced and relied upon back in their home country, in England anyways. And so instead, with this new place, with a bunch of people from different lands and different traditions, they had to create a government. And so they relied on written compacts, such as the Mayflower Compact, and written constitutions as the colonial charters were drawn up as a substitute for the centuries-long tradition that they enjoyed back in England. They felt they had to write it down to clarify it and make it clear to everyone there what the rules were going to be in what was a state of nature. Now, during these, while they were writing these down, they hearkened back to the British tradition of fundamental rights and the rule of law and the separation of powers and checks and balances and representative government and voting. These were all rights and experiences that they drew upon when they drew these charters in order to be able to engage in self-governance. Because remember that even though they were subjects to the British Crown, it took weeks to cross the ocean, and so they could not rely on the king or parliament to make day-to-day decisions. And so they had to come up with these methods of self-governance. Another key difference between America and the British homeland was that in America, land was cheap and labor was scarce. This meant that opportunities were great. Now, unlike in England, where the property had all been carved up during the feudal era, land was not easily obtainable. You had to have tremendous money or political power to acquire property in England. But in America, the colonists, again, discounted the native tribes, looked at this continent as free for the taking. There was many opportunities. If you had a disagreement with your neighbor or a disagreement with the local government, or maybe your father had 6 children and the inheritance was all going to your older brother, well, you just packed up and left, and you went to the frontier and carved out your own piece of property. And so land was readily available and relatively cheap. It was within the means of even the poorest member of society to acquire property here in America. Now this means that a person's future and potential were governed more by their traits and abilities than who their parents were, unlike back in the homeland. Now, on the other hand, because of the long journey and the difficulty of carving out an existence in the frontier, not a whole lot of people wanted to do that. And so it was a tough sell to get people to make that crossing and join the colonists. So there weren't a whole lot of people to work the land. Labor was scarce, which meant it was valued more highly. Now, this means that the need to attract labor meant that laborers had to be treated with more respect than they were back home. England was seriously stratified by class, and your position in society was dictated by your parentage, and your options were quite limited for movement among the classes. Now, there was some movement, but it was extraordinarily difficult to do. Whereas in America, because labor had to be treated with more respect in order to keep it there, there was more equality between the classes in the colonies than there was back home. Also, for the same reason, Americans had greater suffrage, meaning who gets to vote, and more frequent and meaningful elections than their British counterparts. They had more local government, stronger local government. The local government had more autonomy than that existed back in the homeland. And so, again, the average everyday people were accorded a little more respect and had more political rights than they did back home. Now, the colonies protected the rights of all who were living in their territory, even those who did not originate there. And so the notion of freedom of conscience gradually spread through the colonies as well. Now, it's important to note, however, with all this grand discussion of the yeoman farmer and the basis of American citizenship that it has, it's kind of a romantic notion that Thomas Jefferson in particular constantly went back to. But it's important to note that the suffrage was limited to white males with property. Women, slaves, and indentured servants did not enjoy these greater rights and liberties. And in fact, in the South, the answer to the labor problem was not a meritocracy like it was in the North, which valued equality between the classes, but the answer to labor scarcity in the South was to create a fairly rigid aristocracy that relied on slaves to provide the needed labor. Now, these different approaches to the labor problem would sow the seeds for conflict for generations in these early Americans, culminating in the Civil War. By the time of the American Revolution, the Americans had had 150 years of experience in self-governance. This experience was built on the foundation of a British tradition of limited government and protections of fundamental human rights. As the Enlightenment philosophies of social contracts and natural rights and government legitimacy began to take hold among the colonists, the setting was right for the revolution that followed. This concludes presentation 3 on the origins of the American idea. The next presentation will look at the revolution and the dynamics that led to the creation of a new government and a new society. This video is brought to you by Dr. Brian Dilley. I'm a political science professor at Mesa Community College, one of the 10 schools of the Maricopa District.